Hello, I'm Kylie Clackson, and Izzy and I work in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge. Thank you very much for tuning in to hear about how we're using the Brazelton Neonatal Behavioural Assessment Scale, or the NBAS, as part of our research within the PIPKIN project. We'll start with a quick summary of the NBAS for those of you who aren't familiar with how the assessment works, and then we'll talk a bit about the importance of the NBAS in a research context and how it fits with our research interests and the research questions that we're addressing within the PIPKIN study. So the NBAS is ideally conducted, or at least started, while the baby is asleep, so that we can start with the habituation items. And the way that these work is that baby is sleeping, either in their cot or bassinet, or perhaps in their parents' arms, wherever. And we would shine a light across their face, just a little torch, slowly up to 10 times, just to see how they respond to this kind of disturbance of their sleep. And we're looking for habituation responses and a response decrement over time. So we would be monitoring the response to each of these passes of the light across the baby's face. And then in a similar way, we would shake a rattle just in front of the baby's face, again up to 10 times, looking for the habituation response. And then again, we would ring a bell. And I just thought I'd like to share with you this photo, which shows that it's not only the babies and the parents who are interested, but sometimes the household pets as well. And in fact, in this case, the cat was certainly responding much more than the baby was to the sound of the bell. And from here on, the order of the NBAS assessment is not necessarily linear. So it depends very much on the state that the baby's in, and we would try to follow the state that the baby's in and choose which part of the assessment is going to be most appropriate to do next. But I'm going to talk through just a kind of a generally kind of slightly idealized version of the NBAS. So after the habituation items, we might move on to start the reflexes and motor items. I've just put some examples here. These include items where we can look at the muscle tone of the baby, such as the pull to sit, where we're looking at the baby's ability to lift their head as they sit up, their muscles in their neck. Standing and walking reflexes, put the baby on their tummy and observe if they make the kind of motions of crawling and whether they're able to turn their head to the side as they get laid down on their front to make sure that they're not face into the mattress. Reflexes such as sucking, the way that they move their arms and legs and the kind of muscle tone that they have in those, and particular responses such as the startle response. And at some point during these reflexes and motor items, which are specifically designed to gradually get a little bit more taxing on the baby as time goes on, we hope that the baby will find themselves in a suitable awake and relaxed state, ready to do the social interactive items. So we would then jump straight to those when the moment presents itself. And for these items, I will use my trusty helper, Annabelle, who will help me to demonstrate these. And this is looking at baby's ability to track and localize both social and non-social stimuli. So for tracking the face, for example, we would hold the baby in front of us, perhaps resting on our legs, and we would then move our heads around from side to side, watching to see whether baby is able to follow us with their head and with their eyes, and whether the gaze is smooth, etc. We would do that both without speaking for the face condition and face and voice, where we're saying, hello baby, hello, can you see where I'm going? Can you see what I'm up to? Yes, that's right, well done, oh very good. And combining both the face and the voice in the social stimulus. And we would then do that again with a ball and with a rattle, where again the similar thing, we would use a rattle to get the baby's attention and watch to see whether baby is able to turn her head as the rattle is moved about. For the locating items, this would be keeping baby stationary and simply shaking the rattle or using our voice, or potentially the mother's voice, to call the baby's name just to the side of the baby, so they can't see where the sound is coming from, but we're looking to see whether the baby will turn their head towards the sound that they hear. Another part of the assessment that we fit in wherever it occurs is the consoling routine, and this is where we're interested to see how the baby responds to becoming upset, whether the baby is able to soothe himself in any way, or what kind of strategies he's using to do that, and also how much support he requires from the experimenter to bring himself back to a calm and quiet state when he has become upset and entered what we call state 6, which is hard crying. So we would want to watch the baby for a short time to see, first of all, how he's coping with this this being in state 6, with being very upset, and what kind of methods he might be using to try and calm himself down. Babies will often try to put their hands up to their mouth, perhaps try to put thumbs or fingers into their mouth. Sometimes they'll look around. They might see, for example, the light from a window, which might distract them momentarily and help them to calm themselves. So we watch for a little while, looking out for those kinds of behaviours. And then if baby needs further support, we can show our face to baby, include some voice, talking kindly and calmly, place our hand on the baby's belly, hold their arms in a comfortable and comforting way to stop them from stop the startle reflex. Pick the baby up, first of all, just standing stationary. And this is still with the voice, still using the voice, still keeping the hand on the belly, keeping the hands held securely. And if at that point the baby still doesn't settle, we would begin to rock the baby, and eventually, if necessary, we could move to the level of swaddling the baby, and then potentially just putting a finger into the baby's mouth or a dummy for the baby to suck on. And we're interested in seeing how much assistance and support does the baby need from the experimenter to get to a point where the baby is able to settle successfully. And during the NBAS assessment, there are many other things that we as assessors need to be looking at. This is a non-incomplete list, but just to give you a taste, we're looking for the way that the baby moves, the kind of actions that baby makes, how he moves arms and legs, these self-consoling efforts that I mentioned, and also physiological elements such as the skin colour, the muscle tone, tremors. We're keeping note in our head of the state changes, where the baby is sleeping, awake, is happy, is relaxed, is unhappy, etc. And the kind of quality of alertness that we see in the baby. Is the baby able to maintain a state of alertness, to focus on a stimulus, to focus on a face, for example? And that can tell us quite a bit about where the baby's at. And this NBAS system, the scoring system that we use, leads to a kind of a profile of strengths and weaknesses. We have all these different areas. So, for example, habituation, social interactive items, the reflexes, the consoling, etc. And so in each of these different areas, and these are all broken down into smaller kind of subscales, we get a profile of strengths and weaknesses rather than just a single score for a baby. So it's very much about getting to know this individual baby, their specific responses to different stimuli, and building up a profile of them. It's not always possible to get scores to score every different section for every baby. It will depend. Sometimes it's necessary to cut the assessment short if it's too much for the baby, for example. And as you'll see in a moment, the elements of the NBAS that are most relevant for our research project is the habituation set of items and the social interactive set of items. There we go. So these are the ones that we'll be focusing on when we tell you a little bit more in a moment about the PIPKIN study and what we're interested in looking at.
Thanks so much for that, Kylie. So I'm Izzy. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the NBAS in research. And first off, I'm going to give a little bit of background. So how we perceive, understand, and interact with the world, or the development of social and cognitive capacities, are critically important to our lifetime achievements and our well-being. And maladaptive developmental trajectories due to early adversity have been associated with poorer outcomes at the cognitive, social, and emotional levels. And the impact of this can stem into adulthood, affecting our longer-term life outcomes. So from around 20 weeks gestation, we have auditory capacities as our middle ear bones calcify, and it's been documented that then by the third trimester, fetuses have shown kind of preferential responses to the mother's voice over a stranger's by orienting more towards the mother's voice. And that indicates a prenatal emergence of some very early social and cognitive abilities. And further early postnatal studies and also studies of specifically habituation and novelty detection, which are precursors of learning, memory and attention, have also been documented in both prenatal and very early postnatal studies. However, generally speaking, studying infant development across these periods is incredibly difficult due to difficulties accessing the fetus and witnessing its behaviour, for example, as well as stimulating the fetus, as well as difficulties postnatally, for example, trying to get an infant to lie still in a scanner, or designing paradigms that work with a young child when you cannot communicate with them in the same way as an older child or an adult. But more recently, advances have been made in this area, which is really exciting. So one tool to look at this early period of early development is the NBAS. And it's used in research to give further insights into how both prenatal factors may affect us postnatally, and also how early neonatal capacities and outcomes may predict later outcomes in childhood, as the NBAS is used within the first days, weeks, and months of life. So I'm going to go through some quick examples of research studies that have used the NBAS and what they found. So one study found that neonates born to antenatally depressed mothers displayed suboptimal neurobehavioural functioning at 6 days postpartum when they were compared to their healthy counterparts. And this was true across the autonomic, state regulation, state range, orientation, and motor indices. But they found that by 12 months, these differences were no longer significant between the two groups. However, other research has found that subsections of the NBAS at 3 days old can predict infant psychomotor development at 4 months and 12 months, with better scores on the state regulation, state range, autonomic stability, and muscular tone subsections, predicting better psychomotor development at 12 months old. And furthermore, this study also found that at a follow-up that was conducted at 6 years old on these infants, improved scores on state regulation predicted improvements in verbal IQ at 6 years old. So another study found the NBAS correlated with maternal reports of infant irregularity and irritability at birth, but not with regulatory patterns at 3 months old. And this is interesting, as this could point towards a more state-like role of early infant temperament, as opposed to a trait role of this early on. And combined with the other studies discussed briefly, this could point towards the ability for postnatal factors to perhaps buffer prenatal adversity, and a possible link between these earlier regulatory and cognitive mechanisms and later cognitive outcomes. But this also highlights the need for further research with the NBAS alongside other social and cognitive developmental measures, so we can get a fuller and deeper picture of how early outcomes on the NBAS translate and map onto other later outcomes and outcomes within other domains as well. So the NBAS has also been used as a really wonderful tool to compare early neurobehavioural profiles across cultures, and this can be useful to emphasise the generalisability or the lack of generalisability across different populations. So research like this is really important to understand how within different cultures our developmental trajectories may be different, and then you can start to unpick the question of why, and is this optimal for the environment or suboptimal because of the environment, and questions like that, which are really interesting. And finally, as a lot of you know, the NBAS is used often as an intervention, and preliminary evidence suggests that this can contribute to strengthened parental adjustment and understanding of their baby's behaviour. But again, we really do need more research into this area in order to validate and increase the knowledge of the NBAS as a tool for both assessment and intervention.
Thanks, Izzy. So here's a quick overview to the PIPKIN study that I've been mentioning that both Izzy and I are working on. The study is led by Professor Mark Johnson and Dr. Sarah Lloyd-Fox. And as you can see, it's quite complicated, and it's a longitudinal study with a number of different visits at different time points. It's quite intense for the families that are taking part. And this is a study that we haven't yet started the full phase of testing. We've been piloting the testing that we will do at different points throughout the study. At different parts of the study are at different stages of readiness, but we're hoping that we will be starting proper data collection at some point early this summer. So just to talk you through it briefly, we start with an antenatal home visit sometime during the third trimester, and this is where we can explain the study to parents, and obviously because it is quite a large and heavy study in terms of the time commitment, we need to make sure that people really understand what it is that they're getting themselves into. And it also gives us an opportunity to conduct a parent mind-mindedness interview with ideally both the mother and the father, if they're available. And then later on during that third trimester, we would invite the mothers to come to the Rosie Hospital for ultrasound scans. These are 4D ultrasound scans, and we have a variety of tasks that we do at that point, which Izzy will talk to you about in a moment. We then have obviously the grand event when the baby is born. And after the baby is born, we aim to see the family ideally within the first 2 to 3 days, potentially when they're literally just home from hospital, ideally at least during the first week, and then again during the second week, and again at 1 month. So this newborn period is quite intensive. And for these study visits, we would visit participants at their home, and this is where we would do the NBAS, the Neonatal Behavioural Assessment. We would do this at either the first or the second time point when the baby is newborn, and then again at 1 month. At this time point, we also start with the neuroimaging data collection using NIAS to look at the way that the baby's brain responds to social and habituation tasks. And again, Izzy will explain these in a little more detail to you in a moment. And we also collect a parent-child interaction video, just a short video of the parent playing with their child. We then have a further study visit at our baby lab when the baby is 5 months. At this point, the baby will be very much more able to engage with the tasks and do more things. So this is a much longer and more challenging visit, usually split over 2 half days. And at this point, we would repeat the neuroimaging NIAS tasks that the baby has done earlier, add in some EEG tasks. The parent-child interaction video is repeated again. We do a behavioural developmental assessment, the Mullen scales of early learning, and we would also get the baby to take part in some eye tracking tasks. So we've got a really rich battery of assessments at that time point. But we're also interested in what's happening between these very kind of controlled and regulated study visits that we do at the baby's home and at the baby lab, where we present the infant with these very controlled tasks that we ask them to do. And so in between these time points, at the 2 months and 4 months, we're going to run home recording visits. And the idea here is that we get to record some data of how the baby is and how the baby interacts during a normal day at home when they're in their natural environment with no researcher present and no specific tasks or instructions and nothing particularly expected of them. And so on these days, we would visit the family at home in the morning. We would put some equipment onto the baby in the form of specialist clothing holding specialist little devices, a heart rate monitor that also includes an accelerometer that allows us to measure the baby's movement, a head camera, a little camera that fits literally onto the front of the baby's head on a little strap that attaches to a hat, so that we can see where the baby's looking and what kind of things the baby's looking at throughout the day, and also a Lena or audio recorder that picks up the auditory environment. And the idea from this is that it will allow us to get a baby's eye view of the world, and we're particularly interested in getting a measure for each baby as to how much social interaction they engage in a normal day. How much of the time does this baby spend with another person, interacting with them, engaging with them, speaking to them, looking at them, and this will be a really interesting metric that we can then see how that relates to the other parts of the study, where we do have these measures that are very much more kind of scientifically regulated and controlled, where we have, for example, the neuroimaging measures in response to very strictly controlled stimuli rather than a naturalistic environment. And there are three main focuses that we're really interested in exploring with this study. And one of them is looking, as Izzy's mentioned, about this kind of the changes that occur around the point of birth, looking at pre-birth on the one hand, post-birth on the other hand, and looking at individual differences in basic sensory processing that we can see between the late prenatal period and late antenatal period and the newborn period. So comparing what we see in the ultrasounds in the third trimester with what we see in the newborn visits once the baby has been born. We're also interested in that very intense period when the baby is newly born. We want to see the baby for these neuroimaging measures during the first week, during the second week, and also at 1 month. We're interested in the rapid change in cortical functions that takes place over those first postnatal days, and particularly the networks in the brain that process social information. And as I've just explained, the impact of the social environment on the development of brain function. So what we can learn about the baby's social environment at home, the kinds of stimulus that they're exposed to on a day-to-day, normal, everyday basis, and what kind of impact that has on the way that we can see their brain developing and their brain functions developing in the controlled home and lab visits as well. So as I mentioned, you can see where the NBAS fits in as part of our one of the elements that we do as part of our neonatal visits. If I just click the right place, I can show you. These are the other elements of the study which relate to the NBAS. And so these are what we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail now, just to explain to you how these relate and the kinds of tasks that give us information that will be really interesting to match with the data that we get from the NBAS to see what we can learn from that.
So, as previously mentioned, we can already see the emergence of early social and cognitive capacities in utero. And in PIPKIN, we're going to examine prenatal habituation and novelty responses, which are the ability to stop responding to repeated stimuli accompanied by response recovery to novel stimuli, using 4D ultrasound, which is a 3D scan with time, the dimension of time added, so we end up with a 3D video of fetal behaviour. So here you can see a picture of a 2D regular scan, and this is what you get when you do a 3D scan, and we would then have a video of the fetus moving in this way, which will be wonderful. So what we're planning on doing is playing a repetitive auditory stimulus with the sounds ma and possibly me or mo, and along with a non-social sound, and we're then going to examine for fetal orientation responses with the expectation that we would see response decrement with repeating presentations of the same stimulus as the baby gets used to the sound. We would then expect to see response recovery to novel stimuli if the baby is able to differentiate between and process these sounds. And again, as mentioned earlier, these habituation novelty responses are these early markers of learning, memory, and attention. And by examining these behavioural responses in the womb, we can then examine whether these prenatal abilities predict postnatal responses, such as habituation and social orientation items on the NBAS. So alongside the NBAS and fetal ultrasound, we're also looking at some neuroimaging so we can see how these early behaviours relate to early neural activity. So to do this, we're using NIRS, which stands for Near Infrared Spectroscopy, and involves shining light of near infrared wavelength into the brain and looking at how it's absorbed and scattered back. We do this by using a soft neoprene cap fitted with sources and detectors like you can see in the pictures, and we pop this onto the baby's head to record. When we use our brains, the bits that are active need more oxygen, and oxygen binds to hemoglobin, which has a differential absorption spectra to deoxygenated hemoglobin. And so by looking at the amount of light that's absorbed and then scattered back, we can get an indirect measure of the baby's brain activity because that relates to the amount of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood that's present in that area. So in PIPKIN, we have both a social task and a habituation task, and we play these for the babies while they wear a NIRS cap. The social task compares how an infant's brain responds to social stimuli, for example, faces and speech sounds, with non-social stimuli, for example, pictures of toys or the sounds of a car beeping. And you can see an example of this in the bottom left picture. In the habituation task, we are once again looking at how a baby's brain responds to an auditory stimulus that's repeated. So we're asking whether they habituate, so do their brains start to respond less? Is there less activity as the sound is repeated more? And then do we see a novelty response or an increase in activity again when a new sound is played? So all these tasks give us early insights into how cognitive and social developmental trajectories emerge. And by examining neural development alongside behavioural measures such as the NBAS, we can get greater insights into these early trajectories and how they manifest at both these levels, as well as the relationship between them. In the PIPKIN study, we're also trying to untangle how the environment can shape these early trajectories and how factors such as exposure to early stress or postnatal caregiving or maternal diet can shape these outcomes.
So you can see how the NBAS fits in very well with the PIPKIN project and provides us with a behavioural measure that complements the neuroimaging measures that we're taking during the newborn period. But I'd like to mention just a bonus practicality of using the NBAS, and that is that quite apart from the scores that we obtain during the NBAS examination for the use in our research, we've also found that there are other benefits to using the NBAS during a session with parents. And as you've seen, our study is quite intense and we want to see the babies in the study when they're only a few days old. And so it's natural that parents can be a little bit anxious about their first research session with their very, very precious and very, very newborn baby. And we found that doing the NBAS with the parents, explaining to them what we're doing and showing them how their baby, what their baby is doing, really helps to relax parents. And it's as researchers, it's something that we can kind of give to them as a way of making their experience of taking part in the research a positive one. It's an opportunity for us to explain what we're doing. It's much more understandable to parents than some of the more technical neuroimaging measures that we're taking. And it gives them the opportunity to see for themselves what their baby can do. We can point out the baby's cues to the parents and help the parents to understand and to see their child's personality and also what their baby is trying to communicate. It gives us as researchers an opportunity to show to parents that we're confident and we're capable in handling newborn babies. And particularly as some of the members of our research team are quite young and don't have experience holding babies of their own, this is important to show parents that we know what we're doing. And also sometimes it gives us the opportunity to demonstrate to parents that they don't need to be scared about handling their baby. When they see the way that we hold the baby, that we manipulate the baby's position, they realize that perhaps they can be a little bit more relaxed in the way that they move their baby around as well. And also, as a follow-up to parents, after we've carried out the NBAS assessment and talked the parents through it, we also give the parents the Brazelton leaflet, The First Relationship, which reminds them of some of the cues that they might see their baby using to communicate with them. And we feel that this is a really nice way of kind of summing up the session, but also giving parents something that allows them to reflect on what they've seen, what they've learnt, and to consider how they can use this information in building their relationship with their child. So as you can see, the PIPKIN project will hopefully generate a huge amount of data, and there are so many questions that we hope to be able to ask and answer. The research questions that relate specifically to the NBAS, as we've covered, are looking at the parallels between the prenatal measures of habituation and the habituation scores we get in the newborn period as measured by the Neonatal Behavioural Assessment Scale, whether we see parallels and individual similarities and differences. We can also ask whether the behavioural and neural markers of postnatal habituation and social orientation correlate with each other. Both are measured during the newborn period. And also whether the NBAS scores taken during the newborn period predict performance on behavioural assessment at 5 months, and that's the Mullen scales of early learning that we're using at that point. And these are both the NBAS and the Mullen scales are very different, but they're both behavioural assessments to look at normal development. So it'd be interesting to see if we see relationships across that 5-month span. As you can imagine, with the large amounts of data that we're collecting in PIPKIN, it's going to be a good while before we have much to say about the results that we've collected. But we really hope that maybe we'll be able to come back here in a few years' time and tell you some of the answers to these questions and a little bit about what we found.
So this is just to say a very quick thank you to both Mark and Sarah, who lead this study, along with Inga at the Brazelton Centre, who's been an integral part to us incorporating in the NBAS and getting our training. And thank you also to the rest of our team and to everyone for listening. We really hope you've enjoyed this and found it interesting, and are looking forward to all the other talks as part of the Baby Communication Week.